want to just put his comments at first in context of the Institute's work over 61 years now. How do we balance liberty and security? How do we balance the needs of the individual against the needs of the community? The Emancipation Proclamation is exploring these issues. The Constitution is exploring these issues. David's work himself has been exploring these issues. As you know, he's managing director of the Carlyle Group. This is one of his passions. It's a great honor for me and for all of us to be with him today.
Thank you very much. Everybody here has heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of you probably know what it really is. Some of you may not. What I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about what it actually is, what it was not, what it actually did, what it did not do, and how it really changed the course of our country. This is a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. When Lincoln actually signed it, and it was official on January 1 of 1863, the official copy is in the archives. It's very fragile and is displayed very rarely. For souvenirs, for a benefit in Baltimore, my hometown, Lincoln actually signed 30 other copies. Only, I think 6 of them actually sold. They were sold for $10 a piece, but nobody really wanted to buy them. So of the 30 that were signed, I think only about 7 or 8 are in existence now. I bought one of them, and I offered to give it on a permanent loan to the White House to put it in the Lincoln bedroom where Lincoln actually signed it. It was Lincoln's office. In those days, you could meet in Lincoln only had 7 cabinet officers and 2 staff people, and what is now called the Lincoln bedroom was Lincoln's office, and that's where he actually signed the Declaration of Independence. The Emancipation Proclamation, and I thought it should go there. The President Obama said no, it should go into the Oval Office where people could actually see it. And so on Martin Luther King's birthday this year, there was a ceremony at the White House at which civil rights leaders were present, and the President then surprised them, took them in the Oval Office, and showed them that this copy of document I had given to the White House was there, and it'll be there for a while. And the reason I think this is the most important document any president ever signed is because this is the first time a president of the United States, by his own signature, could really change the course of our country. And what it was designed to do was more or less end the war in the Civil War by more or less helping to free slaves. But let me explain the background, how we got to that. The Emancipation Proclamation is a controversial document. It was controversial at the time, and it was controversial afterwards, and even today, many people didn't think it really did very much. The main criticisms of it have been that it wasn't eloquent. Everybody knows the Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln was probably our most articulate president, our greatest writer as a president. The Gettysburg Address was only 272 words, but he captured all of the essence of America in that. This is a legalistic document, so people say, where's the rhetoric? Where is the description of why we have to get rid of slavery? It's not in there. People also say that it didn't really free many slaves because it only dealt with slaves who were in the South. It didn't free slaves in the border states. It didn't free slaves in the northern states. And in the end, some people say it may only have freed 20,000 slaves at the beginning. So people criticize it for that reason. And people also say that Lincoln should have done this much earlier in his term. Why did he wait so much longer in his term to do it? Let me try to explain the background of this and how it came to be and why I do think it is the most significant single document any president's ever signed. In our country, slavery was not a given that we were going to have slavery. In the 1600s, when settlers started in Virginia, the concept of slavery was very foreign to them. There weren't any slaves when the British came over, the English settlers in Jamestown and so forth. There were a few ships that came over with black slaves that had been more or less taken by pirates, and they had been taking them actually intending to take them to the southern parts of the United States where there had been some slaves in Florida. But these slaves were more or less taken into Virginia, and they were considered indentured servants. In the early days of our country, the people who came over from Africa who were brought over were more or less indentured servants. That meant that they came over, and I won't say completely voluntarily in some cases, but in some cases people wanted to leave Africa, some cases people wanted to leave Europe, and they came over to the United States or the colonies, and they were indentured servants. They would work for a few years, and then they would be freed. And there were a fair number of blacks that were in this way, but a lot of whites. And in fact, at one time, we had as many white indentured servants in the United States as we had black indentured servants. And then indentured servants would leave, and they would go back and have other regular jobs after they did their service. what happened was in the 1600s, there was let's say the latter part of the 1600s, there was a riot called Bacon's Rebellion, where indentured servants, after they had been freed, more or less said, we don't really have a great life here. We're still making virtually no money. And there was a concern by the business people and the colonists that actually if they had more and more indentured servants coming over, you'd have more and more disgruntled people who weren't happy with their lot in life once they were freed from their indenture. So gradually the slave owners or the business people began to say that what we want to do is have workers come over, but we want to make sure they're not freed eventually. We want them to be slaves. And so the slave trade began, and it began in earnest really in I'd say the latter part of the 1600s and the 1700s. And actually over a period of time, 12 million Africans were brought over to the Americas. 12 million were brought over more or less as slaves, but most of them didn't come to the United States or the colonies. They went to Brazil, they went to the Caribbean. Only 645,000 Africans were brought over as slaves in the United States, 645,000. And increasingly they were used in the South as people who could work on the farms. They were slaves in the North. Every colony had slaves. In the North, they were more or less people who had worked in homes. They were artisans. They were craftsmen. They weren't really working as farmers. But in the South, as the crops in the South required more and more intensive work, tobacco, rice, sugar, and so forth, it needed a lot of workers. And so gradually, the slaves that were in the North and in the upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, and so forth, were really sent down to the deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so forth, because there was enormous growth in agricultural exports. What happened, though, was it was recognized when the Declaration of Independence was being agreed to that slavery was a problem a bit. There were some people who didn't think slavery was appropriate, but in the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be undeniable or self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When he was talking about all people being equal, he really wasn't talking about slaves. He actually had 2 slaves with him in Philadelphia when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. That he actually owned 60 slaves at that time. And there was some concern about slavery, but in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote a large provision in there saying that the King of England was to be condemned for having fostered this slave trade which brought all these slaves here, and maybe it wasn't a good thing for our colonies to have that. That provision was taken out of the Declaration of Independence. Many of the slave owners who were delegates to the Continental Congress didn't want to criticize King George for forcing the slaves onto the United States because, in fact, many of them really wanted slaves. The slaves were an important part of the economy. And so the Declaration of Independence actually didn't mention slavery. When we got to the Constitution never mentioned slavery either. It was clear that at the time, to have the South and North come together, the South would have to be able to continue its use of slaves. And increasingly, as slaves were needed more and more in the Deep South, they were on forced marches. They were shipped in some cases. They were taken on forced marches, not unlike Bataan death marches. Many of them didn't survive. They were whipped there. They were beaten. They were tortured as they went to the South. And the work in the South was much more difficult, the Deep South, than what they had been doing in Virginia or in some of the northern states. And it was work where they were basically creating farms, they were creating whole villages, they were digging trenches. It was work where very few of them actually survived. And because we had agreed in the Constitution that we would at a certain point not import more slaves, and it was 1808, and under our Constitution it was said that we would not prohibit slaves from coming into the United States before 1808. In 1808, we did agree that we would not import any more slaves. So we had 645,000 slaves, but slaves obviously reproduced. There were more and more slaves. And at the time of the Declaration of Independence, we had probably about 500,000 slaves were then alive in the United States. At the time of the Civil War, we had about 4 million slaves, 3.5 million living in the Deep South, and about 500,000 in the border states and some in the North. These slaves were treated very poorly, obviously, harshly, because the families were broken up. It wasn't considered uncommon to just take a family and split it apart. The people who were most desirable were the people who were the young men who could work. And so very often the slaves would be bought and sold, and the young men who could do the work were the ones who were most desirable. Eventually it was realized that if you have all the men doing all the work in certain areas and they can't reproduce, you're not going to get more slaves because you weren't importing more slaves. So gradually they let families go together, but it was still obviously a terrible existence, and there was no constraints really on slave owners treating their slaves more harshly. There was also no constraints on slave owners having sex with female slaves, because it was decided at that time that if a white slave owner or a white person had a sexual relations and produced a child with a slave, that child was a slave. In other words, it was half white, half black. The father might have been a slave owner, but the child was by definition considered to be a slave. And so therefore there was no penalty to having children by slaves, in effect, because you weren't, as a slave owner, responsible for them. They were considered the responsibility of the mother, and they were considered slaves. And so in this context, increasingly the South was dependent more and more on slaves. As the South was expanding and growing its agricultural base and becoming a very wealthy area, in fact, the South was probably as wealthy as the North right before the Civil War, the dependence on slaves was extraordinary. And the North began to say that the slavery wasn't such a good thing. They wanted to see it abolished, but very few northern states actually abolished slavery. Some of them did, but not all of them had abolished slavery. And so that's the context we have when Abraham Lincoln is running for president of the United States. As you may know, Abraham Lincoln served in the Congress for 2 years before, and he did very little as a congressman. One thing he did really was something that he did that kind of perpetuated his views about and reflected his views about slavery. Lincoln was actually born in Kentucky, and he had some southern roots, and Lincoln grew up basically having a typical view of whites in those days of blacks, which was that they were inferior intellectually, couldn't live together with whites, and really shouldn't be treated as equal citizens. And so when he gave his Gettysburg Address and said that this is a country for and by the people, he was really referring to white people, honestly. Lincoln, when he ran for the Senate against Stephen Douglas in the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, a large part of the debates was whether or not we were going to free the slaves. There were some concerns about that, and Lincoln made it very clear that he thought that whites and blacks probably couldn't live together equally, that he wasn't in favor of freeing the slaves. He did have a view that letting slavery go into the western states, the new territories, was probably going to cause a problem, but he really never called for the emancipation of slaves or the freedom of slaves. When he was in Congress in the 1840s, he did propose legislation which again reflected his views. His views were that if we were going to eliminate slavery, it had to be done according to 4 principles. 1, it had to be done voluntarily. In other words, the slave owners had to agree to it. 2, the slave owners had to get compensation for it. 3, it had to be done gradually. And 4, there had to be colonization. Colonization is a euphemism for the slaves have to be taken out of the country. And Lincoln had always had the view that blacks and whites could not live together. Maybe they were under God equal, but they really weren't going to be able to live together. Lincoln was well known for his fairly racist jokes as a lawyer in Springfield. He was not a person who was then considered like a person likely to be the great emancipator, far from it. So Lincoln had this bill that proposed in Congress, and he proposed these 4 standards, including colonization, which meant that the slaves would be sent to Africa, Latin America, or some other place in the Caribbean. That bill didn't get anywhere. Lincoln left Congress, went back, became a lawyer again. He ran for the Senate, and he had the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, and while Lincoln was considered to have been a better debater, he lost. And the reason he lost was in those days the Senate, the state legislatures picked the senators. So he was running for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. The state legislature was really controlled by Douglas's party, so even though Lincoln probably did a much better job in the debates, he wasn't elected to the Senate. And then Lincoln made a very famous speech in New York at Cooper Union, which got a lot of attention, saying that a house divided against itself cannot survive. And what he meant by that was unclear, but he more or less meant that we can't continue to have slavery dividing the country this way. And the real issue in those days was whether we should have slavery extended to the West. The slave owners in the South, they needed more land for their agricultural pursuits. They were depleting the agricultural land in the South. They were over farming it. They needed more land. They needed more slaves if they were going to have more land. And so they wanted to expand slavery in the West. There was a concern by people in the North that if slavery was extended to the West, that the slave-owning states would have a greater say in the control of the country, and therefore people in the North really didn't want slavery extended to the West. People in the South were afraid that if slaves weren't allowed to be in the West, in the new territories, eventually the northern states would gain more political control and control the Congress much more and have much greater say in the economic fate of the country. So this is the context in which Lincoln ran. When he ran in 1860, he made it very clear he did not support emancipating the slaves. He didn't believe in that. His main concern was keeping the Union intact. However, slave owners in the South believed that Lincoln was likely, in the new Republican Party, to eventually emancipate the slaves. And so he was elected in November of 1860. In those days, you were inaugurated not on January 20th, but in March. They had the elections in November, and under our Constitution, you acted about 6 months before you became president. So before he became president in March, the South Carolina seceded from the Union, and other states began to secede from the Union because they believed that Lincoln would eventually emancipate the slaves, would make it clear that the slavery would not be allowed in the West, and therefore they wanted to have a country that was able to survive with the use of slavery. And so Lincoln, when he became president, said early on in his inaugural address that he didn't say in his inaugural address, "I'm going to free the slaves." He didn't say that slavery was a terrible thing. He basically said his cause in life was to preserve the Union, and that's what he tried to do. So as president, he fought. He led the Civil War. He was commander-in-chief. It wasn't clear to people what being commander-in-chief really meant. Obviously, we put that in the Constitution because it was known that George Washington was going to be our first president, and he had been, in effect, our general. It wasn't clear what responsibilities you had as commander-in-chief, but this was the first time a president really had to run a war, and Lincoln was running the war, and it wasn't going very well. It was going very poorly. The South was doing much better. They had better generals. North had terrible generals. Lincoln was always looking for generals who were trying to do something. He was always afraid his generals were afraid to actually take action. Many of his generals he replaced. He really, not until he got Grant as his lead general did he actually find a general that he was actually comfortable with. In fact, one of his generals he thought was going to lead a coup against him, General McClellan, and in fact, McClellan did run against him in 1864 when Lincoln ran for re-election. So Lincoln was trying very hard to figure out what to do to preserve the Union. And many people in the North said, well, you should free the slaves. There were abolitionists, and many of the people in Boston particularly were in favor of freeing the slaves. The abolitionists were led by people like William Lloyd Garrison and others, and they felt that slavery was morally wrong. Interestingly, some of the abolitionists, while they favored freeing the slaves, they didn't favor keeping the slaves in the United States. They favored actually colonizing them. And many of the abolitionists didn't think that blacks and whites could live together. Lincoln was importuned by many people to do something, but ultimately Lincoln didn't do anything about the slavery problem for quite some time. Lincoln concluded in the end that he was going to lose the war unless he took some definitive action. The South was doing quite well, and he felt that the slavery that the South had was helping them. It was helping them in two ways. One, the Southern war machine, the economy, was being fueled by slaves. And secondly, the Southern soldiers had slaves going with them. And when the soldiers needed all kinds of work done, the Confederate soldiers had slaves working by their side. So Lincoln's view was that if he could get rid of slavery somehow, he could maybe weaken the Southern war machine. And so, without really telling people where he came up with the idea or why he decided to do it, one day he told his first vice president, a man named Hannibal Hamlin, he told him in, I think it was June of 1862, that he was thinking of freeing the slaves and issuing a proclamation, which was a unique kind of document and he was going to call it the Emancipation Proclamation. Hannibal Hamlin, the vice president, who was replaced later by Andrew Johnson. Unfortunately, Hamlin didn't tell very many people until later in life that he'd been told about this. And then one day, Lincoln called his cabinet together. Again, his cabinet was only 7 people. And he met with them. They met regularly on Tuesdays and Fridays. And on a particular Tuesday, it was September, I think, it was in July of 1862, Lincoln said to his cabinet, I've decided that I need to emancipate the slaves. And I'm going to do it, and I'd like your input and your thoughts, not on whether I should do it, but on my statement. I've written it out. It wasn't clear exactly where Lincoln had written it. Some people say he had written this original draft on a ship he had been on. Some people say he had written it at the War Department. He went over to the War Department many times because in those days, the way Lincoln communicated with his generals was teletype. And the only teletype that they really had near the White House was at the War Department, which was not far. So he would spend many hours reading the telegrams and sending them. And at some point, there's a story that he may have actually written the Emancipation Proclamation there. When he met with his cabinet, there was a reaction against it. Many people in the cabinet, or not that many people in the cabinet, but some people said this would lead to insurrection, and it would lead to the slaves, when they hear that they're emancipated, they'll just walk away from their southern slave owners and start killing them. Remember, and many of the Confederate soldiers were the people who were also owning slaves, and they were people who had been living in these on these plantations. Many of the plantations now had women and a few men there, and so there was a fear that the slaves, when they hear that they have been emancipated, they might kill those relatively defenseless people they would have on the plantations, and leading to further insurrection. There was also a fear that this would induce the foreigners to come in. The French and the British had stayed out of the war. They'd stayed out of the war for many different reasons, but there was a fear by some of Lincoln's cabinet that if the South, the Emancipation Proclamation were to go into effect and slavery was ended, the cotton trade wouldn't be permitted to really flourish anymore, and the British and many others depended on the cotton trade. The cotton trade was the single probably greatest crop that we had in the southern states, and it was a big cash cow. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, it made it more productive to get cotton processed more quickly, and as a result, more and more slaves could be used, because the more cotton you picked, the more you could process it quickly, and it was the greatest cash product the United States had, by far the greatest cash product in the South. And so it was viewed that possibly that the Southerners would come in, that the French or the British might come in, because they would be afraid that cotton shortages would occur, and so that was another concern that one of his cabinet members had. Another cabinet member said, "You look like you're doing this from a position of weakness. We've lost almost all the wars. You look like you're desperate now, and you're just freeing the slaves as a desperation move, and so therefore maybe you shouldn't do it now." So Lincoln took this advice into consideration, and he decided that he would think about it, but what he would look to do was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he had a greater position of strength. So he was going to wait for a military victory. Now, the document itself, this is a copy of it. As I said earlier, it doesn't flow with the great rhetoric of the Gettysburg Address, and there's a reason for that. Lincoln was very afraid that if he issued an Emancipation Proclamation, it would be overturned by the Supreme Court. Remember, this Supreme Court had come up with the Dred Scott decision, which essentially said that even a slave who leaves a slave territory, is in a free area, could be taken back to his slave owners, and it said that slaves could not be citizens of the United States. So that decision, that court, led by a man named Roger Taney, Lincoln was always afraid that if he said something about freeing the slaves, and he did it with rhetorical flourish, it would give some reason for the Supreme Court to overturn it. So he issued he wrote this as a legal document, and made it so that it was very tight, and he made it very clear that he was going to do it on a certain basis, and this was the basis. Lincoln did not think that he had the right to free slaves. He thought the Constitution had basically said slavery is part of our country. So there was no right in the Constitution for a president to say, "I don't like slavery, I'm going to get rid of it." Lincoln believed strongly in the Constitution. And so the device he came up with was this. He said that as the commander-in-chief, he had certain war powers. And under these war powers, he could do certain things to help the United States win a war. Well, he thought that by getting rid of slavery, he would help the United States win the war against the South. So he basically invented, more or less, the concept that he would employ the war powers that came to him under the Constitution as commander-in-chief, and therefore he would issue a proclamation that would say that in order to help win the war and preserve the Union, the president was saying that the slaves would be freed. But if he did that and he used his war powers, he obviously couldn't free slaves in the North, because we weren't at war with the North, and he couldn't issue a proclamation against the border states, which hadn't seceded. And so all Lincoln was able to do in his mind was to say, "I'm going to free the slaves in the South," and then hopefully, in his mind, it would ultimately lead to something else. He tried for a long period of time to convince the border states that they should get rid of slavery, and the northern states, and what he was trying to offer them, again, was his favorite, colonization and compensation. He offered the border states some compensation, which he hoped Congress would approve. He offered the northern states the same opportunity to say that if you free your slaves, and most of the slaves that were out not in the South were in the border states. There were 3.5 million slaves in the South, more or less 450,000 in the border states, and maybe 50,000 left in the North. The border states, which were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, were the states he was always worried about. And many of his cabinet members said, if you issue this Emancipation Proclamation, the border states will think that they're next, and therefore they will probably go to the South. So you may risk if you issued the Emancipation Proclamation, having the border states secede as well. So that was another risk that Lincoln had to take into account. But he concluded in the end that if he issued it this way, as using the War Powers Act, War Powers that he thought he had, was the only way that he had legally to free the slaves. And he thought if the slaves were freed, ultimately, it would lead to the destruction of the Southern war machine and ultimately lead to the unification of the country, which is his greatest concern. He was criticized by abolitionists for not acting quicker. He said to people in a very famous letter that he wrote to Horace Greeley, the publisher of a New York newspaper, "My greatest concern is not freeing the slaves. My greatest concern is preserving the Union. If freeing the slaves will preserve the Union, I'll do it. If freeing no slaves will preserve the Union, I won't free any slaves. My concern is preserving the Union." And that's what Lincoln always used as his major important reason for doing this, was to preserve the Union. So as he went forward, Lincoln took the advice of one of his key cabinet members, the Secretary of State, Seward, who said, wait until you have a stronger position. And so what he did is he waited till a battle occurred where the North actually won. And there was a battle of Antietam where the North more or less won. The South lost 10,000 men and the North lost 10,000 men. But Lee was forced to retreat back over the Potomac, back into Virginia. At one point, Lee had crossed into Maryland thinking he could capture Maryland. His soldiers were coming in singing My Maryland, implying that they were about to take over Maryland, singing the state theme. But ultimately, they were forced back into Virginia, and Lincoln said that was a good enough event for him to say that he wasn't looking like he was doing something out of weakness. So on September 22nd, 1862, he issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, saying that he was going to, on January 1 of 1863, actually issue the Emancipation Proclamation if the South didn't recognize that the slaves were freed, they didn't stop fighting, and he offered the South, and he offered the other states as well, during this period of time to be compensated for the slaves that they would give up, and the slaves would be colonized. Lincoln spent a lot of time trying to figure out where he was going to put the slaves, and he came up with more or less the area around Panama, which was his idea to move the slaves there, and his view was that was the only way that could be done. His view was that blacks and whites could not live together, and even the abolitionists were worried about it. The abolitionists thought that the blacks, when they were freed from the South, would come north and take white jobs, and that was a major concern. So many of the abolitionists, as I said earlier, really wanted the slaves to be exported out of the United States. And Lincoln actually did something between the time that he issued his preliminary emancipation, saying, I'm going to issue the permanent one in a few months, unless, I don't need to do so because all the states have agreed to free the slaves and to be compensated for it and to colonize the slaves. During this period of time, Lincoln invited a delegation of 5 blacks, freed blacks, to meet with him at the White House. This is the first time, with the one exception of one black man who had visited James Madison as President of the United States, first time blacks had been in the White House. It was a scandal a bit to have blacks in the White House. Lincoln met 5 black leaders and shook their hands and basically was very, very friendly, they said. And he said to them, look, I want you to recognize that it's not realistic for blacks and whites to live together. And he more or less said there was an inferiority to blacks, and therefore the best thing for blacks would be to leave the country. And I would like you 5 to be leaders of coming up with a place to move the blacks. I have an idea. There's a place in Panama. I think you could work on this. If you can get me some black leaders who will agree to move to this place, I think others will follow, and this can solve the problem. The blacks said they would get back to him. They didn't know how to respond to the President of the United States. They'd never been to the White House. They were intimidated by him. Ultimately, they sent him a letter saying that it wasn't appropriate. They'd lived in this country for hundreds of years, and they weren't going to move anywhere else, and they just didn't want to leave. And that was generally the view of most blacks. Very few blacks actually left at this point in time. So Lincoln, during this period, in the interim period of time between September and January, Lincoln got a lot of advice about what to do. Many people were outraged at what his idea was. Many people thought there would be insurrection in the South, as I mentioned. Many people thought the blacks would descend upon the North looking for white jobs. Many people in the North thought that the Union troops would revolt, because many of the Union troops said, wait a second, we signed up to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. And so there was a concern that the Northern troops might not actually complete their fighting. But Lincoln decided he had to go ahead, and he decided he would go ahead. And he changed the language. He met with his cabinet again. He got some new ideas about how to make the language somewhat better in some ways. And he ultimately came to the end of December, and he was supposed to issue it in a couple of days. His wife urged him not to. Mary Todd Lincoln was dead set against the Emancipation Proclamation. Many of his advisors thought it was really going to lead to his losing the election for sure. There was a lot of political unrest, and many people thought by the time he actually signed this Emancipation Proclamation, he'd be so politically unpopular, he might not even be able to run for re-election. But Lincoln decided to do it. On January 1, the day he was supposed to do it, not having told anybody he was actually going to do it, he then spent some time working on the language. The draft that came over to him had some imperfections in it. He sent it back to the State Department to have the appropriate words put in. And then he had to, as all presidents did that day, meet people who came to the White House. So from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, he had to shake 3,000 hands of people who came through to greet the president. Then he went back upstairs at 2 o'clock and agreed he was going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And then as he picked up the pen, his hand was shaking. He didn't know whether it was a sign from God that he was making a mistake or was a sign from God that he shouldn't be doing this. He concluded in the end that wasn't the case. He concluded in the end that he had been shaking 3,000 hands, and that's why his hand was shaking. But he said, but in truth, if you look at the original, his hand does have a little bit of tremor to it, and it is not the firmest of autographs, but he did sign it. And when he signed it Abraham Lincoln, as he did here too. Normally, Lincoln would sign A. Lincoln, but it was something significant. He would sign Abraham Lincoln to show he really meant it was significant. So we issued this on January 1, 1863, and then what happened? Well, what happened is no slaves were actually freed very much, because if you were a border state, you were not affected by this. If you're a northern state, you were not affected by this. You're only affected if you were a southern state. And if you were a slave owner, you weren't going to say, well, geez, President Lincoln has just freed the slaves, so I'm going to tell my slaves they're free, because the slave owners didn't listen to Lincoln. They had seceded. So the only slaves who were really freed right away were slaves in the South that were in areas that more or less the Union hadn't completely taken over, but they were freed already, or they had escaped. In other words, there were some slaves who had escaped. They were hiding out. They weren't in areas controlled by the Union, because certain areas in the South that were controlled by the Union were excluded from this. If the Union actually controlled something, Lincoln didn't think he could free those slaves. So some people think that maybe only 20,000 slaves were actually freed. In truth, what happened is some slaves heard about this. They began to leave their plantations. They began to look for places to go. And the Union soldiers were now instructed for the first time that when slaves came, they were not to return them. Under legislation that had existed before, if you are a Union soldier and a slave came to you, slaves were property. Property were to be returned to the owners. There was legislation that required the Union soldiers to return these slaves to the slave owners. And sometimes slave owners would come into Union camps and say, well, is there many of my slaves here? And the Union soldiers would say, yes, this slave is this yours, and they would give them back to them. Well, that changed, and now the Union soldiers were instructed to actually not return the slaves. And in fact, there was a proposal, and it actually came about, where the freed slaves would actually fight for the North. Now, there was a lot of reservation about that, because some people in the North didn't think that the blacks could really be good soldiers. They didn't trust them with their guns. They weren't sure whether they were going to really turn around and shoot the Union soldiers. And in fact, ultimately, about 200,000 freed slaves did fight for the North. And amazingly, there were some slaves who fought for the South. And there were some Jews who actually fought in the Nazis, and I always wondered how that could happen. But there were some slaves who actually fought for the South, and they fought very valiantly. And I think their view was that was their country, and they wanted to preserve it, I suspect. But more soldiers ultimately who were black fought for the North, of course. Ultimately, what happened is the Southern war machine did crumble. The North became much stronger. The North won a number of battles, and ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation led to the South, I think, losing the war. And then what happened was when the South ultimately surrendered, Lincoln recognized that all he had done with the Emancipation Proclamation was free some Southern slaves. But he hadn't freed the slaves in the border states. He hadn't freed the slaves in the northern states. And in fact, it wasn't clear now that the war was over that the Emancipation Proclamation was still the law of the land. We weren't at war any longer. So were the slaves now freed, or were they not? So Lincoln's view was the only way you could solve this was by having a constitutional amendment. So he proposed a constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and he worked very hard to get it passed. Even though he wasn't that politically popular at the time, he worked very hard to get it passed. It had to be passed, as you know, by 2/3 of each house. And while the president doesn't have to sign it, if it does pass, actually Lincoln signed his 13th Amendment. He was assassinated before it could be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Eventually it was. but he may have been assassinated in part by John Wilkes Booth because shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation and shortly after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, Lincoln gave a speech about 45 days before he died, in which he said, well, now that blacks are going to be free, some intelligent blacks should have the right to vote. John Wilkes Booth was in that audience, and he said, wait a second, we're going to let blacks vote? One thing to be free, but to let them vote. So John Wilkes Booth later wrote a letter that was obviously found after he was killed that said that this speech sparked his view that he had to kill the president to keep people who are black from voting. Lincoln had a view early on that certain blacks should be able to vote, people who were intelligent blacks, people who were educated. He didn't have the view that all blacks should be able to vote. So the 13th Amendment went into effect. It eliminated the slavery, and ultimately the right to vote became the 14th Amendment. And then what actually happened is the Emancipation Proclamation had the effect of making the United States a much stronger country because the South saw a lot of blacks moving to the North. The North used these workers in the industrial manufacturing area. The United States became a manufacturing center for the world. Much like China is today, we became a low-cost producer of goods. And so the blacks who came to the North helped us become an industrial country. Also, the French and the British began to feel now that they could invest in the United States. And so they became the biggest source of capital to build our railroads and do other things here that really led to the United States becoming a truly a country that really existed from East Coast to West Coast. And so by encouraging Western, or by allowing foreign capital to come in, by helping to the modernization of the industry in the North, it really helped the United States become more of a global economic power than it had been. So the Emancipation Proclamation, while it didn't have soaring rhetoric, it didn't actually free that many slaves, it didn't do all the things that people wanted it to do, and it wasn't done as timely as people wanted. I think it did have the effect of helping us win the war, and it did have the effect of eventually making the United States a unified country, and it did have the effect of making us a global economic power. So I think in the end, Lincoln deserves a great deal of credit. It was probably the most courageous thing any president could ever have done. Lincoln probably recognized by doing this he might well not have been reelected, he might well have been assassinated, but he decided to go ahead, even though he recognized that what his real view was that the blacks and whites couldn't live together. He still thought that slavery was morally repugnant and that it was really dooming the United States as a country. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Yes.
You mentioned that eventually 200,000 freed slaves fought for the North.
Can we just put this mic, because we're recording this session?
Could you tell us the story of how we quickly moved from freed slaves who were, they wanted to push out of the United States and have a colonization effort that we wound up with 200,000 soldiers who were black?
Well, first, the colonization effort never got anywhere. And Lincoln recognized ultimately it was unrealistic. How can you take 4 million people and transport them? First, where would you send them? They didn't want to go. Lincoln always thought that colonization should be a voluntary thing. He didn't think that blacks should be exported out of the country involuntarily as they had been brought into the country involuntarily. He thought it should be a voluntary thing. Well, the blacks didn't want to do it. So in the end, the freed slaves had no interest in colonization, and Lincoln ultimately dropped the idea. There were no integrated troops. The blacks were put in certain army units, and they fought with specific tasks. In some cases, they weren't even given guns because there was a concern about their having guns. But the blacks and whites didn't fight together, and many whites in northern troops really resented having to fight alongside the blacks. But in the end, they recognized that the blacks could ultimately do some work that was going to require some bloodshed, and I guess their bloodshed would be better than their bloodshed, so I guess that was true. And actually, one of the other things that didn't happen was the insurrection in the South. People thought there'd be a lot of insurrection. Actually, amazingly, although most of the 90% of the adult men were fighting in the war, and there were very few black on the plantations, the blacks did not rise up and turn on their slave owners. And the reason for that was, they weren't sure that one set of white men were going to be better necessarily than another set of white men. They weren't yet convinced the North was going to be so much better for them. And secondly, they thought if they actually started fighting and doing things, they would have a lot of bloodshed. They might get killed themselves, and they fought, let the white guys fight this out among themselves, and we'll see, we'll be around to pick up the pieces. So there was very little insurrection, actually, as well. The troops that did fought, though, did quite valiantly for the North. In the end, it was recognized that, that they were quite good soldiers. It had been viewed at the time that they weren't going to be very good soldiers, but in fact, it was viewed that later on that they actually did a very good job. Yes, sir.
Given that the proclamation was on legal ground, it was shaky legal ground, as you said, were there any challenges either in the courts or legislatively to override it?
Okay. In the court, Lincoln always was concerned that they would be challenged in the courts, but nothing, and he was convinced that his nemesis, Taney, would overturn it. Taney ultimately died before a challenge could go to the Supreme Court, and some people say that he died because of the heart attack of realizing that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. Ultimately, Lincoln picked Salmon Chase, his Secretary of Treasury, to be the replacement of Taney, and Chase was a supporter of the Emancipation. It was never overturned. There were only 2 cases brought, and they never got very far, so it was not overturned in court. Congress didn't really have the ability to overturn it, but there were a lot of debates about it in Congress. There were many people in Congress who didn't think it was a good thing, and there are many people in Congress who thought that Lincoln had exceeded his authority, but Congress never actually voted on any legislation to overturn it. Yes, sir.
How did a private equity guy get interested in the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, just because you're a private equity doesn't mean you can't be a good citizen, right? So, right? No, look, it's as simple as this. Some of you were at a speech I gave last year about, to be very quick about it. I heard about the Magna Carta going for sale. I was told that the Magna Carta was going to be auctioned off and was likely to be bought by some foreigner. There are only 17 copies of the Magna Carta in existence. 15 of them are in British institutions, will never be sold. One is in the Australian Parliament, and Ross Perot had bought the only copy in private hands from a British family that had had it in its possession for 500 years. They were land poor. They had to sell it. He bought it in 1982 for about $1.5 million. He put it on display at the National Archives. He had a dispute with the National Archives. He got mad with them at one point. He decided to put it for sale and didn't put any restrictions on it that it had to be sold to somebody in the United States. My view was that if it left the United States, this document, which was a predecessor document, inspiration for the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, wouldn't be here. So I thought it would be a good thing to keep it here. So although I didn't really, I'd never been to Sotheby's before, and I don't collect anything, I decided to go to Sotheby's and bid on it. And, you know, I didn't tell my wife, because you don't tell your wife you're going to buy the Magna Carta. And and I didn't want to tell my children, because you know, I figured my children, you know, they would say, how much less money does this mean for us? So I just basically went there that night, and nobody knew who I was. I showed up. They put me in a little room. I started bidding, and the next thing I know, I won. So they came up and said, like, who are you, and can you pay for this? And so I said, yes, I can afford it, and I won it. And they said, well, you can slip out the side door, and nobody will ever know who you are. I said, no. There were reporters there, about 100 reporters. I said, I want to give it back to the country, put it on display at the National Archives permanently, because it's a gift to the country. I came from very modest circumstances. The country's been great to me, and so I viewed it as a gift to the country. And so once that happened, I started getting offered other documents, and while I got offered a lot more Magna Cartas, and I kept saying I thought I had the only one in private hands. But eventually I realized they were a lot of fakes, and so I have a letter that say I'm not going to try to corner the market on Magna Carta, so I'm not buying anymore. But a couple other documents were brought to me. I bought 2 copies of the Declaration of Independence, rare copies, and one of them is now on display at the State Department at the Benjamin Franklin Room, and the Declaration of Independence will probably be at someplace prominent soon. And this one is now in the Oval Office. So I bought some of the things that I think are kind of good things to do for our country. I don't want to put them in my houses or anything. I want to just have them on display where people can see them. The Magna Carta is now on display and will be forever at the National Archives, and it gets a lot of people who want to see it. It's a 700-year-old document. It's not in great shape, and we're putting a new casing to it. And the reason there's so few Magna Cartas is there are 35 counties, more or less, in England. Every time a Magna Carta was issued, there were 5 different versions of it, the 1215 through 1297. They were issued, but they're on parchment. Parchment is animal skin, and mice and rats eat them. And so they got eaten up or they got lost. And think about when you file something away, And can you find it 5 years later? Well, these things are, 700 years old, so that's why there's so few Magna Cartas left. But I got into it because I thought it was a good thing for, as an American to do, that's all. Yes.
You mentioned that there was a provision that after 1808 there would be
Yes.
no more slaves imported to the U.S. Could you give a little more of the background to that, how that came about, what was magic about 1808, how was that negotiated?
Okay. In the Constitutional Convention, there was concerns about slavery. As you know, we ultimately concluded that slaves were worth 3/5 of white people. And so for the census purposes, slaves counted as 3/5. That actually gave a lot of power to the South. That's why the South became so politically powerful, because slaves were counted for political purposes, for congressional representation and so forth. But when the debate on slavery occurred, it was agreed that slave trading, importation of slaves, was not something that we wanted to keep doing. And so ultimately it was recognized that we wouldn't be allowed. After the Constitution was adopted, they set a date. They said no more slaves will be allowed in after 1808, and that was the date. They didn't, and so actually when 1808 came, Congress actually passed a law, and the British and the United States agreed that there would be no more importation of slaves into Britain or in the United States, and the slave trading would be eliminated. It occurred in other countries, and slavery wasn't eliminated in the other parts of the world for a much longer period of time. But actually what happened perversely was when slave trading was eliminated and you couldn't import slaves, the slaves we had in the United States, they became more valuable. And so they began to be sold. In fact, the biggest business in the South was agriculture and plantations. The second biggest business was slave trading. And therefore, there were people who made enormous livelihoods trading in slaves because we only had a finite number of them. They had to reproduce, but we didn't actually import more. So it was recognized. The reason we got to 1808, it was a certain period of time that after the Constitution was ratified, that people thought we should not be importing more slaves. It was maybe morally repugnant, and they just thought it was not a good thing to do. But they didn't want to actually eliminate slavery because too many southern states then depended on it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that you thought this was the most important document signed by a president.
Right.
I was wondering, but it was also very controversial at the time. When do you think it was sort of appreciated in the proper historical context? And also, do you think the country has the capacity today to sign a similarly important document?
Well, many academic critics have said that this document is relatively insignificant. In fact, many black leaders at the time thought it was a modest way to do things. Lincoln should have freed all the slaves, not just the ones in the South. So it was criticized a lot. And scholars in recent years have also said that while it had some great things it may have done, it actually was not as significant a document as it could have been. And some people thought that the lack of rhetoric in it was really a failing on Lincoln's part. And in fact, when the 100th anniversary came along in 1963, it was proposed that the 100th anniversary of the emancipation should be celebrated at the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial. And actually, in the Lincoln Memorial, if you've been there, there's wording on the memorial from the Gettysburg Address and from the second inaugural address. There's no wording from this because there's no great wording in it. And President Kennedy, unfortunately, chose not to go and didn't want to be seen at the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, in part because the South was still not happy with it. And so it hasn't been fully recognized as a great document as maybe the Declaration of Independence is, or even the Gettysburg Address. It's only in recent years that people recognize that it probably was more significant than people thought it was at the time. I don't know whether any president today could do something as significant as that. In those days, the country was much simpler, and it was easier maybe to do certain things than you could do today. But I don't know whether any current president could do, or future president could do something as significant as just ending more or less slavery by the stroke of a pen. Any other questions? Time for one or two more? Yes, Stuart. Stuart, you have a microphone?
David, you're brilliant, and I admire you so much, and thank you for all you do for America. What happened between 1865 and 1964? Historically, I've never.
Okay.
Did we just go brain dead?
What happened between the time of the end of the Civil War and, let's say, the Civil Rights Act of '64? What actually happened is To get reelected, President Lincoln wanted to have an appeal to the South. He wanted to say to the South, look, I'm not really trying to destroy you. So he got rid of Hannibal Hamlin from Maine and put Andrew Johnson on as his vice president. Johnson was a Southerner, and he really was not in favor of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was really not in favor of the equality that blacks were entitled to. So he didn't take, and remember, he was impeached in part because of that. He didn't really do things that helped the South do things that would have led to better treatment. So what really happened is the Jim Crow laws came into effect. Southern states, eventually, after a couple years after the Civil War, the Southerners who had been slave owners basically passed laws that that put Jim Crow kind of laws into effect. That said, okay, yes, you're a free person, but you can't vote. And you can't, or you can't effectively vote because of a poll tax. You can't go to certain schools. You can't do certain things. And so segregation took over, even though it wasn't legally allowed theoretically by the Constitution. We essentially had state laws that permitted blacks to be treated as an inferior people, and really not until the civil rights laws passed in 1964 and subsequently did we really do much about it. And I remember now growing up as a young man before the Civil Rights Act of '64, as a young boy, and where I grew up in Baltimore, there were segregated schools and there were segregated buses and there were segregated restaurants and so forth, and that was what happened. We went from a situation where blacks were slaves to a situation where they were second-class citizens, and it was more or less accepted for 100 years or so. So, time for one more question, and it is right here.
David, listening to you right now, so many things seem similar, although acknowledging the clear differences of where we are today. With the immigration problem, the political issue, we don't have a war going on, but there's so many similarities. Is there something we can learn from this process, or is it just so vastly different that they just can't mesh?
Well, clearly there is certain degree of animosity towards new people coming in. As you know, our country was built by immigrants, but now we have a concern that immigrants coming in are going to destroy the lifestyle or the work, the livelihood of certain people. And so there are some similarities. Fortunately, we don't have anything that requires people to be slaves, technically, but we do treat people who are immigrants in ways that are not ways we would like to be treated ourselves. So I don't know exactly what we can do about it, but I do think that it requires a president, or any president, I'm not criticizing the current president, but somebody to do what Lincoln did. Lincoln took a while for Lincoln to stand up and do what he did, and Lincoln didn't actually claim that he was freeing all the slaves initially. He took it one step at a time, maybe too slowly, and maybe it's too much to ask for any one president to all of a sudden solve the immigration problem. But Lincoln did take some moral steps that I think really deserves a lot of credit, and I think he's our greatest president because he really kept the Union together. It would have been very easy for a president of the United States to come in and say, look, the South, you want to secede? Fine, I'll be the president of the North, and I'll run my northern part of the United States, and I'll be that way. Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union, and I think that was what the most important thing he did as president, and that's why he gave his life, and that's why I think he is, without doubt, I think the best president we've ever had. Thank you all very much.
David?